Hello and welcome to VarroStories. In this video I will tell you about the Dungeons & Dragons inspired story, The Cursed Blade. Kale stood over the remnants of the battlefield, his sword slick with blood and dust. The air was thick with the smell of death and smoke, the echoes of clashing steel still ringing in his ears. His army had triumphed over the invading horde, but the victory felt hollow. The cost had been high. His comrades lay dead or dying, their final cries fading into the distance. His body ached, his muscles sore from hours of combat, but it was the weariness in his heart that weighed the heaviest. He had fought countless battles, but this one had been different. This time, it felt as if something ancient and malevolent had watched over the carnage, something far more dangerous than the enemy they had slain. His eyes scanned the blood-soaked ground, and there, partially buried beneath the fallen bodies of both soldiers and beasts, lay something that caught his attention. A sword. It was unlike any he had ever seen, black and steel with runes etched into the blade, glowing faintly as if alive. The hilt was adorned with intricate carvings of a forgotten language, and the grip was worn, as though many hands had once held it. Despite the darkness that seemed to radiate from it, there was an undeniable pull to the weapon. Kale approached cautiously, a sense of dread creeping up his spine. He had heard the stories, whispers among old men and legends told by retired soldiers. The Blade of Elric. A cursed weapon, forged by a long-dead king who had sealed his soul within it to grant it unimaginable power. The blade had been passed down through generations, each wielder more powerful than the last, until it consumed them entirely, their bodies aging and withering as it drained their life force. But Kale was no fool. He was a seasoned warrior, a leader among men, and the lure of power was something he had long resisted. Still, his hands reached for the hilt before he could stop himself. The moment his fingers brushed against the sword, a jolt of energy shot through him, like a surge of lightning. It filled him with an overwhelming sense of strength, of victory. He could feel his muscles swelling with newfound might, his senses sharpening. In that instant, he knew that the blade was no mere weapon. It was a living thing, its hunger insatiable. And yet, despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his mind, Kale could not bring himself to release it. The blade was beautiful, magnificent, and it called to him. It promised him power beyond imagination. With it, he could crush any enemy, command legions, and become a legend whose name would echo through the ages. So, he took it. He took the cursed blade and rose, leaving behind the corpses of his fallen comrades. He would return to his people as a hero, his victories assured. For the first few days, Kale reveled in the power of the blade. He wielded it with unmatched skill, cutting down enemies with ease, his every strike a deadly work of art. His soldiers cheered him, rallying around him as their leader, their champion. But as the days wore on, something began to change. It was subtle at first. His muscles, though strong, began to ache as if they had been used far longer than they should have. His face, once youthful and full of vitality, started to show signs of aging. Wrinkles appeared where there had been none, and his hair began to gray at the temples. He thought little of it at first. He had fought countless battles, and perhaps the toll of war was finally catching up to him. But the changes didn't stop. They grew worse. He began to hear whispers in the dead of night. Soft voices that called his name, urging him to wield the blade in ways he had never before imagined. They promised him more power, more victory, but with each passing night, they grew louder, more insistent. They fed on his desires, on his need for glory, for recognition. The blade had taken root in his soul, and its hunger had only begun to grow. One morning, Kale awoke to find his reflection in the mirror. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. His once bright eyes were dull and sunken, his face gaunt, the lines of age etched deeply into his skin. He touched his face, his fingers trembling. How had this happened? Only a week had passed since he first held the sword, and yet it felt as though a lifetime had passed. A sharp pain pierced his chest, and he fell to his knees, clutching at his heart. The cursed blade, was feeding on him. It had begun to drain his very life force. The realization hit him like a blow. The power it had given him came at a terrible price. "Cale! Cale, you are mine," the voice whispered again, a cold, mocking tone lacing its words. The sword's whispers had become a constant presence in his mind, and it was growing harder and harder to resist. Desperation clawed at his heart. He had to find a way to rid himself of the blade. He could feel its power coursing through him, but it was no longer the invigorating force it once was. It was poison, eating away at him from the inside out. He needed help. He needed a way to break the curse. Cale sought the counsel of the kingdom's wisest sage, an ancient elf named Ilarion. The sage's home was deep within the enchanted forest, a place where time itself seemed to slow. When Cale arrived, the elf stood at the entrance of his humble dwelling, his eyes wise and knowing. "I see you have found it," Ilarion said, his voice soft but filled with sorrow. Cale could not hide the blade, even if he wanted to. It was a part of him now, and wherever he went, it followed. He nodded grimly. "I need your help." "The blade, it is killing me," Cale confessed, his voice ragged. "It grants power, but it drains my life in return. I don't know how to stop it." Ilarion gazed at the blade with a mixture of reverence and fear. "The blade of Elric," he murmured. "It is a weapon forged with dark magic, bound to the soul of a king who sought to live forever. But as all such bargains go, it is a cruel one. The blade consumes the wielder's vitality, aging them rapidly until there is nothing left but dust." Cale clenched his teeth. "How can I stop it?" Ilarion was silent for a long moment. Finally, he spoke. "There is a way, but it will not be easy. You must return the blade to the place of its forging, the mountains of Valgor, where the king who created it first bound his soul to it. There, in the heart of the mountain, is a forge older than time itself. You must destroy the blade in that forge. Only then will its curse be broken." Cale's heart sank. The mountains of Valgor were located beyond the edge of the world, a place few had ventured, and fewer still had returned from. The journey was treacherous, filled with dangers from beasts, bandits, and the very elements themselves. But Cale knew he had no choice. If he did not rid himself of the sword, it would consume him completely. The journey to the mountains was long and arduous. Cale's body continued to age with every passing day, his skin becoming more and more like that of an old man. He felt the blade's whispers constantly now, urging him to turn back, to take the easy way out. But Cale's resolve was firm. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he reached the foot of the Valgor Mountains. The winds howled, and the peaks loomed above him like the fingers of a giant. It was here that the final trial would take place. As Cale climbed the rocky paths, the sword in his hand felt heavier with each step. It was as though the blade knew its end was near. The whispers turned to screams, and Cale could feel the blade pulling at his very soul. But he continued onward, his determination unwavering. At the heart of the mountain, he found the ancient forge. The flames were cold, the air heavy with the weight of centuries. It was here that Elric had bound his soul to the blade, and it was here that the curse would finally be broken. Cale lifted the blade above his head, his body trembling with the effort. The sword screamed in protest, but Cale did not listen. With one final cry, he thrust the blade into the flames. The forge erupted in a burst of light, and Cale was thrown back, the power of the curse unraveling in a flash of blinding fire. When the light faded, the blade was gone. And Cale, though weary and frail, was free. The whispers were silenced. The curse was broken. But Cale knew the price. He would never be the same. The years had been stolen from him, and though he was alive, he was no longer the man who had first drawn the blade. But as he left the mountain, he carried with him the lesson of the cursed blade, a lesson in the dangers of ambition and the cost of power. and in his heart, he knew that he had, at least, saved others from the fate he had narrowly escaped. Thank you for making it to the end. Please feel free to use this story as inspiration for your games.